Story 1. Back when I was in high school, I remember that my friends and I found this secret room inside of the school. The room wasn't actually hidden or anything, but it was a classroom that was no longer used. Now it was vacant and just stored a bunch of random stuff in it. You see, the school that I went to was pretty old, but it had been renovated several times. This caused the overall layout to be somewhat strange, and this classroom was in the corner of a normally quiet hallway. It was not in an area that would normally get a lot of foot traffic. My friend Michael was the one that originally found it. I'm not sure how, but I guess he must have just been curious and tried opening the door. Apparently the lock on the door didn't work, so it would just open. So Michael, me, and 2 other friends are the ones who knew about it. We had a bit of a friend group, and we went in, and it was interesting to see all the stuff in there. It had some things from over 10 years ago, such as old assignments from various teachers and old equipment. There were box TVs that were on those stands with wheels and old whiteboards as well. The room also had desks scattered about and tons of books. It was quite cluttered and had carpeted floors as well. So my friends and I would occasionally go into the room and hang out before school, between classes, during lunch, or other random times. It was just our secret hangout spot for the friend group. We were certain that nobody knew we were in there, and we made sure that nobody was looking whenever we went in, which was pretty easy. So one day, in between classes, I went there with 3 other friends. It was right before our last class of the day. Michael had told us to meet there in our friend group chat. He wanted to talk about some plans to hang out and play basketball over the weekend. So I remember that everybody left to go to their classes except for me and Michael because we had a class together, and it was really close by. We were still sitting at desks and talking when we heard this sound come over the school intercom. It was strange because I didn't know what it was about, but shortly after, we heard this announcement that the school was being locked down. In my time in high school to that point, we had never had a lockdown before. I didn't really know what the reason for it was, but I was a little bit nervous. Obviously, in a lockdown, you're supposed to go to the nearest classroom and nobody's allowed to be in the hallways. Michael and I thought about walking to our classroom, but then decided to just stay in the room that we were in. I mean, we were in a classroom after all, and nobody probably even knew that we were here. There had been lockdown drills at the school before, so we knew the basics of what you're supposed to do: turn the lights out in the classroom and lock the door. There was a cover already over the small window in the door to this classroom, so whether the light was on or off you really couldn't tell from the hallway. So we left it on, and then I went to try to lock the door. However, I remembered that the lock on the door seemed to be broken. I mean, that's how we were able to get in the room in the first place. We figured that that wasn't a big deal though, so Michael and I just sat in random desks in the room, talked, and went on our phones and waited for the lockdown to be over. Neither of us had any idea as to what it was for. Other than us, things were very quiet. We texted some friends trying to figure out what was happening, but nobody seemed to know. Then I would say about 15 minutes into the lockdown, we heard footsteps approaching in the hallway. I was sitting not too far away from the door, so I quickly got up and turned the light off just in case it was visible at all from the outside. The footsteps continued to get closer, and Michael and I got really concerned. We probably weren't supposed to be in here in the first place, so whoever this was, if they came into the room, we had to hide very quickly. We decided to just find a hiding place now. There was so much junk in the room that it really wasn't too hard to find a hiding spot. Michael and I took about 10 seconds to get in our places. He went in the far corner of the room behind a cabinet, and I hid on the ground to the side of the desk. The classroom was also very dark, so it would not be obvious where we were. Then, just moments after hiding, the footsteps reached right outside of the door. The doorknob turned, and the door opened. Then we heard somebody entering. I looked up from where I was. I saw this man walk in, but I couldn't really tell what he looked like because of how dark it was. I was confident that he couldn't see me, though. When the guy got inside of the room, he closed the door quietly, then stood just inside of the entrance. After a few seconds, he took a few steps into the room. Michael and I were both trying to be as quiet as we possibly could. I literally held my breath for a while before breathing as quietly as possible. The man was just standing around a few feet inside the room for a while. This went on for maybe 5 minutes. I wasn't sure who this guy was, if he worked for the school, or if he was possibly the cause of the lockdown. He didn't really seem like a teacher, and I didn't know why he would enter this room, so I was starting to think that it was the latter. Then, out of nowhere, Michael made a sound. I think that he just moved slightly. I'm not sure why, but you could just barely hear it because of how quiet it was. When this happened, I heard the man in the room suddenly move a little bit. Then he spoke. The guy said, "What was that?" "Is somebody in here?" My heart started beating like crazy, but I didn't move or make a sound. Michael did the same. After a few moments of silence, the man called out again, asking who was there. He sounded aggravated and even kind of nervous. Then he shouted, asking if anybody was inside of the room. Michael and I did not make a peep. Then we heard the man quickly walk to the doorway, and the door opened up seconds later. Then the man left. I let out a huge sigh of relief, and I'm sure that Michael did the same. We stayed in our hiding places for a while though, just in case the man were to come back. Probably about 20 minutes later, there was an announcement that the lockdown was over. We felt much better. We then left the classroom and went to our final class of the day. Later after school, we were able to find out that the lockdown was caused by a suspicious man inside of the school. Based on what I heard, I'm 100% certain that the man that entered the classroom we were in was the same guy. He must have been trying to find a place to hide, and we were already in there. Apparently, Michael must have scared him off. I'm really glad that the guy didn't try to find us or anything and just left. Story 2. This happened when I was in high school. It was my sophomore year, and this was during the first semester. I remember that I was sitting in my history class, and we were just watching a documentary. That's what we did most of the time in that class. So right in the middle of it, the door to the classroom opened, and this random student walked in. She said my name, and she was holding what appeared to be a pass in her hand. So I got it from my desk and walked over to her. When I took the pass from her, it was for me to go to the library. I was confused at first because I was not aware of why I had to go to the library, and I had not been expecting to get any kind of pass at all that day. I showed the pass to my teacher, and then he said that I could go. So I left the classroom and headed out into the hallway. Now, class was about halfway over at this point. The library was basically on the complete other end of the school and was usually very quiet. So I remember walking there, and maybe 2 or 3 minutes in, I heard over the school speakers that we were having a lockdown. Right when I heard this, I wasn't sure what to do. I could try to go to the library, or I could try to go back to my history classroom. It would be a couple of minutes either way. I decided to go to the library, but as I was walking maybe 30 seconds later, I saw a classroom, and I knew that one of my friends was in that class. It was also a teacher that I had later on in the day, so I had the idea to stop and go to that classroom. When I went to the door, I knocked on it, and the teacher was very quick to open the door and let me in. Then I joined that class in huddling towards the back corner of the room. The lights were off, and things were really quiet for the most part. There was a little bit of whispering, and nobody seemed to know what the lockdown was about. However, about 15 minutes later, there was another knock on the classroom door. I think most of us in the room got nervous when we heard it. The teacher went to the door and soon opened it up. I heard the voice of our vice principal, and he spoke quietly to the teacher for a few moments before the teacher went back to her desk and wrote something down. Then the vice principal went to the door again, and he asked if there was anybody in the classroom that was not supposed to be there. Right when I heard that, I got really nervous because I was the only one who was not supposed to be there. It was pretty clear that it was directed at me, so I was about to get up and admit it. But then the teacher spoke up first and said that everybody in the room was supposed to be there. The vice principal thanked her and then left. I felt a little bit relieved but also more confused. I thought that maybe the vice principal was just trying to keep track of everybody or something, but the way that he worded things was strange. Then not even 5 minutes later, there was another knock on the door. This time it was a teacher, and she was the librarian. I got even more nervous because I was originally supposed to go to the library. The librarian entered and briefly spoke with the teacher. Then she called out my name and said that I had to go with her. I got up and walked to the front of the classroom. Then I left with her, and the librarian took me to the library, which was basically empty, except for 2 other teachers, a janitor, and another student. Then the librarian closed the door and told me to have a seat at the table, and she and the other teachers were talking about something. I wasn't able to hear what they were saying, though. Then maybe 10 minutes later, I heard some more teachers talking and walking over from a hallway that was nearby. They were in this teacher's lounge area, and I heard a few people mention something about a kid named Jimmy. I wasn't really sure who Jimmy was or why the lockdown was happening because of him, but I really wanted to know. About 20 minutes later, there was an announcement that the lockdown was over, and we could all go back to our classes. So I left the library and started heading back to my history class. While I was in the hallways, I heard some other kids talking about what had happened. Apparently, there was this kid named Jimmy who was skipping class and causing problems. I think he might have been new to the school. When he was skipping class, he found some spare change in the hallways and threw it at some students. He threw some coins at some teachers too. Then he found a stink bomb, and he must have somehow lit it and threw it into a classroom, and that was what caused the lockdown. I also heard that when the lockdown started, Jimmy didn't go to a classroom. Instead, he just hid somewhere in the school, and it took some time for the teachers and security to find him and take care of him. Story 3. When I was in high school, I remember that the school did these random dress-up days. This one was during my senior year, and it was Twin Day. Twin Day was where you would find a friend or a group of friends, and you all had to dress the same or at least wear the same colors or something like that. So my friends and I planned it out. There were 4 of us, and we decided to just wear the same outfit, which was a red t-shirt, blue jeans, and white shoes. It wasn't anything too special. But I remember that we all met up at our school cafeteria for breakfast that day before classes started. Now, the school that I went to was known to be very chaotic and always had some issues with kids getting in trouble or fights happening. I wouldn't say that it was a bad school, but these things happened often enough that it wasn't a surprise. So my friends and I ate breakfast and then headed to our first classes of the day. I had a science class with my friend Evan. I remember that we were learning about something to do with biology that day. Anyways, about halfway through the class, the school went on lockdown. This was not the first lockdown that we had. I had already experienced 2 in the school, and we just went into the standard procedure. We went to the corner of the room, lights off, locked the door, and waited. Our teacher said that we all had to be quiet, so everybody stopped talking. I texted some friends, but nobody seemed to know what was going on. I remember that the lockdown took a really long time. Normally, the ones that I had experienced before were no more than 15 minutes, but this one was much longer. We ended up staying in the corner of the room for close to an hour, and it seemed like nobody really knew what was going on. After a long wait, the lockdown was finally lifted. There was an announcement from the school, but it did not explain why the lockdown happened. We just all went back to our seats and finished the class. Then later on in the day, during lunch, I finally found out what had happened. One of my friends in the friend group of 4 told me what he heard. Apparently, 2 students got into a really big fight in the bathroom. They had some sort of a rivalry that had been going on for a while and hated each other. I didn't know who they were, but they were both seniors. One of the guys was actually carrying a small knife with him, and when the fight broke out, he pulled out the knife. The other guy ran, and then the student with the knife chased him out of the bathroom. I think it must have been a pretty chaotic scene because somebody else saw it and reported it. That was what caused the lockdown. As soon as the fight broke out and the knife was pulled, the school was notified, and the lockdown happened. Security had to find the students, and they were found very shortly after the lockdown ended. The kid with the knife was arrested, and the other kid was okay but had to be sent home for the rest of the day. It's crazy because if I didn't have my friends, I probably would have never known what happened. Story 4. I remember one time when I was a kid, probably around 10 years old, my family and I went on a camping trip. We drove out to this beautiful national park that had a huge forest, a clear blue lake, and lots of wildlife. It was the kind of place where you could really disconnect from the world and just enjoy nature. I was so excited because it was my first time camping, and I had been looking forward to it for weeks. We set up our tent near the lake, and I spent most of the first day exploring the area with my younger brother. We saw all sorts of animals like deer and rabbits, and even a few birds that I had never seen before. The highlight of the trip, though, was the night we spent around the campfire. My dad had brought all the stuff we needed to make s'mores, and he told us some spooky stories as we roasted marshmallows. I remember looking up at the night sky and being amazed at how many stars there were. It was a clear night, and you could see the Milky Way stretching across the sky. We don't see stars like that in the city, so it was really special for me. That night I fell asleep to the sound of crickets and the gentle lapping of the lake water. It was one of the most peaceful nights I've ever had, and I still think about that camping trip whenever I need to relax and clear my mind. Story 5. Back in college, I was part of a study group that would meet every week to go over our assignments and help each other out with difficult topics. We were a pretty diverse group with people from different majors and backgrounds, but we all got along really well. One semester, we had a really tough statistics class that we were all struggling with. Our professor was known for being particularly strict and not very approachable, so we had to rely on each other a lot to get through the material. We decided to meet up at the library every Wednesday night to go over the week's lectures and homework. Those study sessions were a lifesaver. We would spend hours working through problems together, explaining concepts to each other, and sharing tips and tricks we had picked up. We even made up silly mnemonics and songs to help remember formulas. One time, we got so caught up in our study session that we didn't realize the library was closing, and we had to be politely escorted out by the staff. By the end of the semester, not only had we all passed the class with good grades, but we had also become really close friends. We kept meeting up to study for other classes and even started hanging out outside of school. That study group taught me a lot about the value of teamwork and how much we can accomplish when we support each other. Story 6. The Pennsylvania system crackled to life on a Thursday during second period in my junior year of high school. The familiar tones of the recorded voice filled my classroom. Lockdown. Locks. Lights out of sight. Lockdown. Locks. Lights out of sight. The words kept repeating as Mrs. Danbury paused at the board and looked up at the speaker in the corner of the room. "Okay, you all know what to do," she said, rushing toward the classroom door to shut and lock it. Nervous chatter went up among the students as we rose from our desks and moved into position against the wall. "Is this real?" my friend Colin asked, as we sat on the floor with our backs to the wall.
"Must be," I said. "They'd tell us if it was just a drill."
The sound of helicopter rotors was faintly audible over the recorded voice of the lockdown alert, and the noise grew louder as we sat there in the dark classroom. After a few moments, it sounded like the helicopter was right over the school. A full minute passed before the helicopter moved again, the noise making it sound like it was going in circles above the campus. A loud bang, like a door flying open, sounded outside. Someone yelled in the hall, a sound that was quickly replaced by automatic gunfire. I slammed my hands over my ears along with many other students. Some of the girls and even a few of the boys covered their mouths as they cried out softly. More gunfire erupted out in the hallway. It sounded as if there were 4 or 5 guns firing. An inhuman screeching sound pierced the air, making my eyes go wide. I looked over at Mrs. Danbury, whose face was drained of all color. She was nearest to the door, the nearest to whatever the hell was going on in the hallway. The gunfire stopped, and I heard a man shout and then scream. His wail of pain stopped abruptly with a loud crashing bang. I didn't have to see it to know that he'd been thrown into the lockers lining the hallway. The metallic bang was enough to tell me that. More gunfire sounded outside and then more screaming. Then there was silence for several seconds. We all listened hard for anything outside. The recorded voice was still going, and the helicopter was still faintly audible. The sound of running footsteps suddenly came to us from the hall. The footsteps stopped abruptly, and a terrible scream erupted just before the door to our classroom smashed in. A SWAT officer flew backward into the room and slammed into Mrs. Danbury's desk, which slid several feet from the impact. Cries of fear came from the students around me as they saw the soldier was missing an arm. He'd hit the desk with his mid-back and had come to rest at an angle that told us his spine was broken. Once the soldier came to rest, there was only silence from the hall. It went on for long enough that I was starting to think the danger had passed. Mrs. Danbury apparently thought the same thing, because she crawled toward the doorway where the smashed door was hanging open. I don't know what she was trying to do, but as soon as I saw her move toward the doorway, I wanted to tell her to stop. Still, I made no sound for fear of attracting whatever was outside, if there was anything there at all. She peeked her head around the door jamb to peer into the hall. Her left hand came up to her mouth as if trying to keep herself from getting sick. She stood up and turned around to face us. "Okay, we need to move to another classroom," she said. "The hall looks." A long blistered red and black arm with a claw-like hand darted down from the ceiling outside the doorway and grabbed Mrs. Danbury by the neck, stopping her words. It yanked her out of the classroom before any of us knew what was happening. We heard a scream and a thunk from outside. Then Mrs. Danbury appeared in the doorway again, only she didn't have any arms. Blood spewed from her massive wounds as she stepped into the room, looking back over her shoulder with a dazed look on her face. What she saw there snapped her out of it, and she started running toward the wall of windows opposite the doorway. Fountains of blood poured out of her as she ran past her desk, screaming. A monstrous scarred figure that looked like a badly burned mix between a bear and a baboon darted through the doorway after our teacher. It left, smashing into Mrs. Danbury just as she reached the window. The two of them tumbled out, falling to the ground just a few feet below. My teacher screamed once more outside before her vocalization stopped with a terrible ripping sound. All of us stayed frozen against the wall, staring at the broken window, waiting for the thing to come back in. We should have run, but we didn't. It was all too much for us. Eventually, the gruesome sounds from outside stopped, but none of us were willing to risk standing up and moving toward the window to see what was happening. Not long after those noises stopped, we heard a flurry of gunshots from far off, likely off the high school campus. Hearing those faraway shots snapped me out of shock. I stood up and moved slowly to the doorway. I looked out to see the hallway littered with dismembered bodies. There was blood all over the place. A man with a smashed head lay below a huge and bloody dent in several of the lockers across the hall. A few other guys and I led the rest of the class out. We headed toward the evacuation spot and were about halfway there when we ran into more police coming into the school. They took us to safety. We were told it was an escaped animal from the zoo. That's even what they said on the news that night. They said it was a bear. But I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't any animal I've ever seen. And the fact that there's a military research base not far from our school is just too much of a coincidence. But those of us who were in that classroom that day are smart enough to keep our mouths shut. But we know the truth. We'll always know the truth. Story 7. The clock struck midnight as Lily tiptoed down the creaky wooden stairs of her grandmother's old house. Shadows danced on the walls, cast by the flickering candle she held in her trembling hand. She had always been curious about the basement, a place forbidden to her and shrouded in mystery. Lily's grandmother had warned her never to go down there, saying it was dangerous and full of secrets best left undiscovered. But tonight curiosity got the better of her. She had to know what lay behind the heavy, iron-bound door at the bottom of the stairs. With a deep breath, she reached the basement door and, with some effort, turned the ancient key she had found hidden in her grandmother's dresser. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, musty room filled with old furniture, dusty books, and strange artifacts. As she stepped inside, the candlelight revealed a large, ornate mirror in the corner of the room. The mirror was covered in a thick layer of dust, but something about it drew her closer. She wiped away the dust with her sleeve, revealing a beautiful, intricate frame and a reflection that seemed almost too clear. For a moment, Lily thought she saw something move in the reflection, but she dismissed it as her imagination. She continued to explore the room, finding old photographs, letters, and trinkets that told the story of her family's past.
Just as she was about to leave, a soft whisper filled the room. Lily.
She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The whisper came again, this time clearer. "Lily, come closer." She turned back to the mirror and saw a figure standing behind her in the reflection. It was a woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, her eyes filled with sadness. "Who are you?" Lily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman in the mirror reached out a hand, and Lily felt an inexplicable urge to take it. As their hands touched, a wave of cold washed over her, and the room seemed to spin. When the dizziness subsided, Lily found herself standing in a different place. The basement was gone, replaced by a beautiful garden bathed in moonlight. The woman from the mirror stood beside her, smiling. "Thank you for freeing me," the woman said. "I've been trapped in that mirror for centuries, cursed by a jealous sorcerer." Lily looked around, amazed. "Where are we?" "This is my home," the woman replied. "And now it can be yours too, if you wish." Lily felt a strange sense of peace wash over her. "I think I'd like that," she said. The woman smiled and took her hand. Together they walked into the moonlit garden, leaving the old house and its secrets behind. Story 8. I'll start this off by giving a trigger warning. The story has gun violence, death, and some of the aftermath. I understand if that's really upsetting to some. All of the names in the story have been changed to keep the privacy of the people involved. Back when I was a sophomore in high school, I went to a relatively infamous high school. Most people in the area saw it as a place full of violence, drugs, and poverty. Some organizations even prevented students who had long since graduated from attending their events or classes because they didn't want to be associated with it. I often saw fights, and I knew some of the students carried drugs. My ex at the time had even threatened to kill me a few times during the year with an imaginary finger gun to the head. Thinking back on it now, that really haunts me. It was all too close to a reality that had yet to unfold. Yet, even with all that in mind, I never really felt that unsafe. It was just how the school was and had always been. That was until the end of the year. It was during finals and we were all busy worrying about grades and GPA. I came to class early and sat in my seat next to my friend. We talked about whatever was interesting at the moment, other than finals, the project I was working on, the boy she kissed, and some benign drama about a couple that we knew. Normal teen stuff. Usually, every morning we'd have the bell chime. We wouldn't even have any morning announcements until the next period, so class would begin almost right away. Just as we were getting to the juicy bit, we were interrupted by an announcement 3 times followed by, "This is a lockdown. This is not a drill. There's an active shooter in the building. Teachers, please lock your door and shelter immediately." I felt an emotional gut punch right to my stomach. There was a rush of students and chaos in the hallways as people pushed into our classroom that I hadn't ever had class with before. Once the room was at full capacity, the teacher locked the door and then slammed it shut. I sat there frozen in my chair with a clear view of the now eerily empty hallway. What was I supposed to do again? We had gone over this over the year, and yet I couldn't even remember. "Mr. Valdez scolded us for not moving out of our seats in clear view of a potential shooter, so we moved to the other side of the room and onto the cold, hard carpet. I can still feel the fibers under my hands as I remember this. What the hell, a student randomly yelled from within our room. Shut the expletive up, a wave of a stage whispered back, including the teacher. The room went quiet after this rush of anxiety. A student stared pale face down at their phone in hopes of knowing what was going on and where the shooter was. The entire school was dead silent. If anyone had made a sound, it could be heard on the other side of the building. Without warning, I heard 3 distinct shots. At the time, I didn't register what they were, nor how much they meant at the moment, how it had extinguished someone's life in a blink. I'm pretty sure Mr. Valdez knew exactly what had happened, and he was trying to distract us while we were all hunkered down. "Oh, I forgot my coffee. Damn it," he said with a cheeky grin as he crawled across the floor to retrieve his cup from his desk. He grabbed it and then proceeded to look out the slats in the blinds to see if he could make out anyone or anything outside of our room. No one. "Did they forget us?" someone asked. There was no answer. Nobody was confident enough to answer. He climbed back over to his hiding spot and sighed his coffee in a silly manner. I owe him a lot for being so comforting in such a scary time. "Mr. Reed is dead," a student said. "Someone said he got shot. We can't know that for sure, Mr." Valdez made sure to correct them. "I feel sick even now. Mr. Reed was my health teacher. I had just talked to him the day before. He couldn't actually be dead, right? Right? I felt my body begin to shake after the initial numbness had finally worn off. I put my head into my knees and closed my eyes and just prayed to whoever and whatever I could. "Can we just go?" the same student from earlier said. "Literally just shut the hell up. Why? There's a shooter out there, you dumbass." I could then hear a helicopter flying over the school followed by what sounded like thousands of distant sirens. This was real. How was this real? I wanted to call my mom on my ancient flip phone and cry and tell her that I was still alive, but I was afraid that would change. Plus, the teachers had always told us not to jam the cell towers in an emergency like this, so I just sat there silently with tears gathering in my eyes. Suddenly there was a huge bang. I grimaced, thinking it was something bad, really bad. Law enforcement in heavy armor kicked through the door at the end of the hall, and I think the beginning of it too. I saw an excited police dog being held back past our door, followed by someone yelling, "Drop it. Oh my God, the shooter was in our hallway. Drop it now," I heard again in an even louder and more commanding voice. Instead of hearing more yelling or something worse, I heard a metallic clang, a sound I still don't even understand now. Who was dumb enough to be in the hallway? I heard more yelling from another part of the building. "Miss Buchanan, open your door," followed by silence. "Open your door now, what the hell was going on?" I then heard multiple people walking at a fast pace down the hallway and then disappearing. Had they moved an entire class? The building went silent again. My heart dropped. Did they not even get the shooter yet? I could hear students crying in the next room over. The feeling was mutual. It felt like hours had gone by, yet it had only been 30 minutes. Before I could get more upset, a sheriff was at our door with his AR-15. He unlocked it and opened the door and then commanded us all to get up, leave your belongings, come out with your hands up. My entire class got up and we did as we were told. Out of complete stupidity, I grabbed my backpack. I'm really thankful that he didn't tackle me right there. We were escorted in a line out of the school with our hands up. When we reached the commons, there were multiple officer checkpoints set up watching us with trained guns. I'll never forget the fear that was in the air. We have snipers on you. If you make any sudden movements, we will disable you. I felt like I was going to throw up. I'm really surprised I didn't. It would have probably made things worse anyway. When we exited the building, I was greeted with more law enforcement, firefighters, and medical personnel than I'd ever seen in my entire life. The parking lot was jam-packed with them. We were stopped and commanded to form several lines before we could cross the street and off campus. The officer put my backpack in a pile with the others and then began to pat me down. They stopped around my left pocket and then looked at me with a serious glare. "Ma, what is this lip gloss, sir?" He then moved to my other pocket. "And that's my cell phone, sir." He then nodded at me and told me to walk across the street. By this point, I was then instructed to have my arms behind my head. "As soon as you pass through this checkpoint, you're no longer under arrest," he told me. I felt relief to some weird degree, but the rest of my body still felt like it was buzzing. I kept looking back across the street to the lines of students waiting to be discharged with us. The school didn't even look the same anymore. I remember the moment I was free. I then called my mom. I didn't cry like I thought I would, though. "Hey Mom, I'm alive." Those words were strange. She told me that both her and my dad were waiting for me at the evacuation spot at the local grocery store. I was surprised my parents had gotten off work to get me. Something about that was just wild to me. I mean, that whole thing at the school hadn't really just happened, right? By the time I was waiting for my ride to the evac spot, I was greeted with the most horrific thing that I'd ever heard in my life. "Ma and Am, you weren't supposed to. Where's my son? Where's Flynn? Please tell me he's okay." "Ma, Am." Then I heard the sound of a mother who had just lost her child. Her loud cries forever seared into my mind. It's hard to really explain the way you get blasted with it when you hear it. That day we lost 2 people, and only one was injured. I'm so glad that it wasn't more. And the most chilling detail, the shooter brought enough ammo to take out almost the entire school if they hadn't been stopped. And no, before you ask, it wasn't my ex. He dropped out of school and moved way before this had happened. If you're ever in this situation, and I hope to God you never are, please make sure to stay out of the view of whatever the danger is and be smart. It could literally save your life. And for anyone wondering about the shooter, I really don't want to tell too much, as it could literally give away the school this happened at. However, they were sentenced to life in prison without parole, and that's all you need to know. To anyone who lost someone in this sort of tragedy, I'm so sorry. I know that sounds pretty hollow, but I really mean it. I hope you have found some solace. Please, if you can, share any of your stories below. Story 10. Growing up, there was always this one house in my neighborhood that everyone said was haunted. It was an old, Victorian-style house with peeling paint and overgrown weeds. The windows were always dark, and the whole place just had a creepy vibe. My friends and I would dare each other to go up to the porch, but no one ever had the guts to go inside. One Halloween, when I was about 12, a group of us decided we were finally going to do it. We were all dressed up in our costumes, hyped up on candy, and feeling brave. We snuck out after dark and made our way to the house. The closer we got, the more my stomach churned, but I didn't want to back out and look like a coward. We stood on the porch, trying to peer through the dirty windows, but we couldn't see anything. The door was slightly ajar, and one of my friends, Jake, pushed it open. It creaked loudly, and we all jumped. Inside, it was even darker than outside. The air was thick with dust, and it smelled like mold and something rotten. We all had flashlights, so we turned them on and started exploring. The house was a mess, with broken furniture and trash everywhere. It looked like no one had lived there for years. We made our way through the first floor, finding nothing but cobwebs and creepy old portraits on the walls. Then we heard a noise from upstairs. It sounded like footsteps. We all froze and looked at each other, wide-eyed. "Did you hear that?" whispered Sarah, one of my friends. "Yeah," said Jake. "Let's check it out." I didn't want to, but I couldn't back out now. We slowly made our way up the creaky staircase, our flashlights shaking in our hands. At the top of the stairs, we saw a long hallway with several closed doors. The footsteps had stopped, and everything was eerily quiet. Jake, being the bravest of us, walked up to the first door and slowly opened it. The room was empty, just like the ones downstairs. We checked the other rooms, one by one, finding nothing but dust and more broken furniture. Then we got to the last door at the end of the hall. It was different from the others, newer, like it had been replaced recently. Jake reached for the doorknob, but before he could touch it, the door swung open on its own. We all screamed and stumbled back. Inside, the room was pitch black, but we could feel a cold breeze coming from it. Our flashlights flickered and then went out, plunging us into darkness. I heard Sarah start to cry, and I felt like I was going to pee my pants. Then, out of the darkness, we heard a low, growling voice. "Get out." That was enough for us. We turned and ran as fast as we could, stumbling down the stairs and out the front door. We didn't stop running until we were back at my house. We were all out of breath and terrified, but we couldn't stop laughing, partly out of relief and partly because we couldn't believe what had just happened. We never went back to that house, and as far as I know, no one else did either. A few years later, it was torn down, and a new house was built in its place. But I'll never forget that Halloween night and the feeling that something was watching us from the darkness. Story 11. When I was a kid, I lived in a small town surrounded by woods. My friends and I would spend our weekends exploring the forest, building forts, and pretending we were on grand adventures. We knew the woods like the back of our hands, or so we thought. One summer evening when I was about 10, my friend Tom and I decided to go on a nighttime adventure. We had our flashlights and a backpack full of snacks, ready for anything. We set out just as the sun was setting, making our way to our favorite spot, a small clearing with a big rock in the middle that we called the fortress. We were about halfway there when we heard a strange noise. It was a low, guttural growl, unlike anything we'd ever heard before. We stopped and looked at each other, trying to figure out what it was. Then we heard it again, closer this time. "Maybe it's just a dog," Tom said, but I could tell he didn't really believe it. We kept walking, but now we were on high alert. Our flashlights darted around, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The growling continued, growing louder and more menacing. I felt a chill run down my spine. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. I turned my flashlight in that direction and saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me from the darkness. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Tom," I whispered, "do you see that?" He turned his flashlight towards the eyes and gasped. The creature stepped out of the shadows and we got a good look at it. It was unlike any animal I'd ever seen. It was tall, almost as tall as a person, with long, matted fur and sharp claws. Its eyes glowed a bright yellow, and its mouth was full of razor-sharp teeth. We didn't wait to see what it would do. We turned and ran as fast as we could, not caring about the path or where we were going. We just knew we had to get away. The growling followed us, growing louder and more frantic. I could hear the creature crashing through the underbrush behind us. We finally burst out of the woods and into the safety of Tom's backyard. We slammed the gate shut behind us and collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. The growling had stopped, and everything was quiet again. We never told anyone about what we saw that night. We knew no one would believe us. But we also never went back into those woods after dark. Whatever that creature was, it was still out there, and we didn't want to take any chances. I've always been fascinated by the stars. Ever since I was a kid, I've loved looking up at the night sky, trying to find constellations and wondering what else is out there. So when I heard about a meteor shower happening one summer night, I knew I had to watch it. I live in a rural area, so finding a good spot to watch the meteor shower wasn't hard. I grabbed a blanket, some snacks, and my telescope and headed out to a field a few miles from my house. It was a clear night, and the stars were shining brightly. I set up my telescope and lay down on the blanket, watching as the meteors streaked across the sky. It was a beautiful sight, and I felt a sense of peace and wonder. Then, around midnight, I noticed something strange. One of the meteors wasn't moving like the others. It was hovering in the sky, shining a bright, steady light. I grabbed my telescope and focused on the light. What I saw made my heart race. It wasn't a meteor at all. It was a large, disc-shaped object, hovering silently in the sky. It had lights all around its edge, glowing a soft blue. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I watched the object for what felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. It didn't move, just hovered there, as if it was watching me. Then, without warning, it shot off into the sky at an incredible speed, disappearing from sight in seconds. I was left staring at the empty sky, my mind racing with questions. What was that? Was it some kind of experimental aircraft? Or was it something else, something not from this world? I packed up my things and headed home, still in shock from what I had seen. I wanted to tell someone, but I knew they would think I was crazy. So I kept it to myself, but I've never forgotten that night. Every time I look up at the stars, I wonder if I'll see that mysterious light again. Story 13. When I was a kid, I used to spend a lot of time at my grandparents' house. It was an old, creaky house full of antique furniture and strange noises. My grandparents would always tell me that the house was haunted, but I never really believed them. I thought they were just trying to scare me. One summer, when I was about 11, I was staying at their house for a week. My parents had gone on vacation, and I was excited to have some time with my grandparents. The first few days were uneventful, but then things started to get weird. One night I woke up to the sound of someone whispering. I sat up in bed and listened, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. It was faint, but I could hear it clearly. It sounded like a woman's voice, but I couldn't make out what she was saying. I got out of bed and followed the sound down the hall. It led me to the guest room where I was staying. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see a faint light coming from inside. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was empty, but the whispering continued. I looked around, trying to find the source of the sound. Then I noticed something strange. The old rocking chair in the corner of the room was moving, slowly rocking back and forth on its own. I felt a chill run down my spine. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. I just stood there watching the chair rock. Then the whispering stopped, and the chair came to a halt. The room was silent again. I ran back to my room and hid under the covers, too scared to sleep. The next morning I told my grandparents what had happened. They didn't seem surprised. My grandmother just nodded and said, "That must have been Eliza. She used to live here, you know." I asked her who Eliza was, and she told me that Eliza was a young woman who had lived in the house a long time ago. She had died in the guest room, and ever since, strange things had been happening in the house. My grandparents believed that her spirit was still there, watching over the house.
I didn't know what to think. I wasn't sure if I believed in ghosts, but I couldn't deny what I had seen. For the rest of the week, I was on edge, constantly looking over my shoulder and listening for any strange noises. I never saw or heard anything else, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone.
To this day, I still don't know if what I experienced was real or just my imagination. But every time I visit my grandparents' house, I can't help but think of Eliza and wonder if she's still there, watching over the place she once called home. Story 14. When I was in college, I joined a hiking club. We would go on weekend trips to different trails and explore the wilderness. It was a great way to unwind and get some exercise, and I loved the sense of adventure. One weekend, we decided to hike a trail that was known for its beautiful scenery and challenging terrain. It was a remote area, far from any towns or cities. We set out early in the morning, excited for the day ahead. We decided to take a short break and figure out what to do. As we were resting, we heard a faint sound coming from deeper in the forest. It sounded like someone was calling for help. We all looked at each other, unsure of what to do. The sound was coming from off the trail, and we knew it was risky to go off course. But we couldn't just ignore it. We decided to follow the sound and see if we could help. We made our way through the dense underbrush, following the faint cries for help. The further we went, the louder the sound became. Finally, we came to a small clearing. In the middle of the clearing was an old, abandoned cabin. The cries for help were coming from inside. We approached the cabin cautiously, our hearts pounding in our chests. The door was slightly ajar, and we could see a dim light coming from inside. We pushed the door open and stepped inside. The cabin was empty, except for a small, flickering candle on a table. The cries for help had stopped, and everything was eerily quiet. We called out, but there was no answer. We searched the cabin, but there was no sign of anyone. It was as if the person who had been calling for help had vanished into thin air. We were all on edge, unsure of what to do. We decided to head back to the trail and report what we had found to the authorities. As we were leaving the cabin, I noticed something strange on the floor. It was a small, old-fashioned key covered in dust. I picked it up and put it in my pocket, thinking it might be important. We made our way back to the trail and reported the incident to the park rangers. They promised to investigate and thanked us for letting them know. A few days later, I got a call from the park rangers. They had searched the area and found no sign of anyone. The cabin was empty, and there were no footprints or any other evidence that anyone had been there recently. I told them about the key I had found, and they asked me to bring it in. When I did, they examined it and said it was an old, antique key, probably from the early 1900s. They had no idea how it had ended up in the cabin. To this day, I still don't know what happened that day, who was calling for help, and how did the key end up in the cabin. The whole experience was surreal and left me with more questions than answers. But I'll never forget that hike and the mysterious disappearance in the forest. Story 15. When I was a kid, I had a doll that I was absolutely obsessed with. It was a porcelain doll with curly blonde hair and a frilly pink dress. My grandmother had given it to me for my birthday, and I loved it more than anything. But there was something strange about that doll. From the moment I got it, weird things started happening. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and find it sitting in a different spot than where I had left it. Sometimes I'd hear faint giggling coming from my room, even when I was alone. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but then things started to get more intense. One night I woke up to find the doll sitting on my bed, staring at me with its glassy blue eyes. I hadn't put it there, and I knew my parents wouldn't have either. I was terrified, but I didn't want to get rid of the doll. It was a gift from my grandmother, and I felt like I had to keep it. So I tried to ignore the strange things that were happening and hope they would stop. But they didn't. In fact, they got worse. One night I woke up to the sound of whispering. I looked around my room, but I couldn't see anyone. Then I noticed the doll was gone. I searched everywhere, but I couldn't find it. I was starting to panic when I heard the whispering again. It was coming from my closet. I slowly opened the closet door, and there was the doll, sitting on the top shelf, smiling at me. I screamed and ran to my parents' room, telling them everything that had been happening. They didn't believe me at first, but when they saw the doll in the closet, they started to take me seriously. My dad decided to get rid of the doll, and he threw it in the trash the next day. I thought that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. The next morning, the doll was back in my room, sitting on my bed. I was terrified and begged my parents to get rid of it for good. My dad took the doll and drove it to the dump, making sure it was gone for good. After that, the strange things stopped happening, and I was finally able to sleep peacefully. But I'll never forget that doll and the terror it brought into my life. To this day, I can't look at a porcelain doll without feeling a chill run down my spine. Story 16. When I was in college, I used to drive back home every weekend to visit my family. It was a long drive, about 3 hours, and most of it was on a lonely, deserted highway. I usually enjoyed the drive, but one night, something happened that still haunts me to this day. It was a rainy, foggy night, and I was about halfway home when I saw a figure standing by the side of the road. It was a young woman, drenched from the rain, with her thumb out, trying to hitch a ride. I normally wouldn't pick up hitchhikers, but she looked so desperate and vulnerable that I couldn't just leave her there. I pulled over and rolled down the window. "Do you need a ride?" I asked. She nodded and got into the car without saying a word. She was shivering and looked like she had been walking for hours. I offered her a blanket from the back seat, and she wrapped it around herself gratefully. We drove in silence for a while, and I couldn't help but feel uneasy. There was something off about her, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I tried to make small talk, but she only gave me short, one-word answers. Finally, I asked her where she was headed. She told me she was going home and gave me an address that was a few miles ahead. I told her I could drop her off, and she nodded, still not looking at me. We reached the address she had given me, and I pulled over. She thanked me quietly and got out of the car, disappearing into the fog. I waited until she was safely inside before driving away. The next day, I was telling my family about the hitchhiker when my mom's face went pale. She asked me to describe the girl, and when I did, she looked like she was going to faint. She told me that years ago, a young woman had been killed in a car accident near the spot where I had picked up the hitchhiker. The locals believed that her spirit still haunted the highway, trying to get home. I didn't want to believe it, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. The girl's strange behavior, her reluctance to talk, and the eerie feeling I had the whole time. It all added up. I've never driven that highway at night again, and I always think twice before picking up hitchhikers. I'll never forget the vanishing hitchhiker and the chilling realization that I may have given a ride to a ghost. Story 17. When I was in high school, I used to babysit for a family that lived down the street. They had 2 young kids, and I would watch them on Friday nights while the parents went out. It was an easy job, and the kids were always well behaved. One night I had just put the kids to bed and was settling down to watch some TV when the phone rang. I answered it, but there was no one on the other end. I figured it was just a wrong number and hung up. A few minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, when I answered, I heard a faint, raspy voice whispering my name. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I asked who it was, but there was no response. The line went dead. I was starting to get really freaked out, but I didn't want to scare the kids, so I tried to brush it off. But then the phone rang again. And again. Each time, the same raspy voice would whisper my name, and then the line would go dead. I was terrified and didn't know what to do. I called the parents and told them what was happening. They told me to hang up the phone and wait for them to get home. They would be back as soon as they could. I hung up the phone and tried to keep myself calm. But then the phone rang again. This time, the voice didn't just whisper my name. It started saying other things, creepy things, like I'm watching you and I'm right outside. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the kids and locked us all in the bathroom, the only room with a lock on the door. I called the police and told them what was happening. They said they would send someone over right away. We huddled in the bathroom, waiting for what felt like an eternity. The phone kept ringing, but I ignored it. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens outside. The police had arrived. They searched the house and the surrounding area but didn't find anyone. They said it was probably just a prank, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more sinister. The parents thanked me for keeping the kids safe and drove me home. I never babysat for that family again. The experience left me shaken, and I couldn't get the sound of that raspy voice out of my head. To this day, I still get chills whenever the phone rings late at night.